But it's great to be here. Thanks for coming back. If you were here last week, it's a great sign of kindness to come back again for a second round. But hopefully today your hope will touch on subjects or conversations that you'll have with people in your everyday workplaces about why it is that you either might be a Christian or might consider making a shift from what you currently believe to one other kind of belief system. Let me share with a little bit of my background experience. In my high school years, had a close friendship circle that you could introduce as somewhat of a bad joke. So my closest three friends, one was a Hindu, one was a Muslim, and one was a Christian. And so you can imagine that when it comes to what it is that they believe, they all had very different ideas, particularly about the person of Jesus. See, the Christian believed that Jesus was God and that he rose from the dead in history. The Muslim believed that Jesus was just a prophet and that he never really was crucified. And the Hindu friend of mine didn't really know what to think when it came to the person of Jesus, but he was fairly happy to welcome him into his already existing pantheon of 330 million gods. And you see, when it boils down to it, we need to recognize that every single religion or broader worldview actually makes exclusive claims when it comes to answering some of life's biggest questions. Things like origins, where do we come from? Meaning, why are we here on planet Earth? Morality, how is it that we should choose to guide our decisions in life between right and wrong? And ultimately, destiny, where are we going to go when we die? And when you explore beyond just my own friendship circle and upbringing, then to broader society, you'll recognize that our culture, the world around us, is a veritable melting pot of beliefs and peoples and languages and ideologies and philosophies. You'll find in this city a mixture of atheism and Taoism and nihilism and Mormonism and existentialism and so many isms that you don't know what to ultimately do with them. Now, these are just a few of the many of the spiritual options that are kind of on offer in the smorgasbord of our own time. Or if, like most young people growing today, you don't have to accept an entire system, you just walk into the shopping center of beliefs, going down the aisle, choosing for your own cart what it is that you want to believe, a grouped together kind of mismatched series of beliefs, or make it your own recipe for religious beliefs. So what I want to do today is explore this question of how do we ultimately make sense of exclusive claims. Now, let's take Christianity, for example. The first commandment amongst the 10 in the Bible says that there is only one God and that you should worship the Lord your God and him only. The great commandment, as described by Jesus, says that you're to love this God with all of your being, your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus himself claimed to be God in the flesh and the only way to be reconciled to God the Father. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Fast forward into the book of Acts, and you'll have the Apostle Peter telling the Jewish leaders of his day that there is salvation only in the name of Jesus. The Apostle Paul told the Greek philosophers that they had to repent of their pagan religions and philosophies and ultimately turn to Jesus in Acts 17. You see, Christianity at its core is built on exclusive claims to truth. And no amount of origami with the text of the Bible can skirt this implication that Christianity claims to be the one true religion in a world of spiritual options. Now, from recent sociological research here in Australia, these exclusive claims of Christianity measure as one of the top belief blockers as to why most people in Aussie culture will not take Christianity seriously. I mean, exclusivity just seems arrogant. Who are you to say, especially at a young age like mine, that you've happened upon the truth where people far wiser, more intelligent, smarter, and who have lived longer have ultimately not found it? And exclusivity kind of seems intolerant. How can you believe that you have the monopoly on religious truth and that other religions and billions of people are all wrong? And to some, exclusivity even seems dangerous. I mean, doctrine kind of divides. And in a world that stands in the shadow of terrorism, there are those who are imbibed with a fear that religion poisons everything, that dogmatic beliefs will ultimately lead to people strapping on bombs. Now, exclusivity is simply out of vogue in a society like ours, one that seems to be governed by the principles of the new kind of tolerance. And so this is the topic of what we're looking at today. How do we then make sense of Christianity's supposedly intolerant claims? Why do we claim exclusivity? So when it comes to this, how interacting with my three friends, the Christian, the Muslim, and the Hindu, there's three ways that I would say people in Aussie culture try and make sense of exclusivity, try and make sense of these different religions and what they claim. The first option is to say that all truth is ultimately relative. The second option is to say that all religions are ultimately the same. Or the third option is to say that not all ideas are created equal. What I quickly want to do is just catalog those three options to see which one makes the most sense. So let's explore the first one. Is truth relative? Now, what is to stop me trying to make sense of my friends' beliefs to simply declare that what they believe is ultimately true for them? That Christianity is true for the Christian, Islam is true for the Muslim, and Hinduism is true for the Hindu. You have your truth, I have mine. This is the kind of approach of the postmodern person in our time. And as the child of existentialist philosophy, postmodernism sort of places the individual, the person, at the center of their own reality. No longer do you tell this person that their beliefs have to conform to the world around them. Instead, the promise of postmodernism is that the universe, the world out there, will conform to the beliefs that you hold in your own mind. And so when it comes to metaphysics or the realms of religion, everything just rewires to go along with what it is that you've ultimately believed. You decide what is true, and for most, they make those decisions on the basis of feelings, not some kind of external logic. And so in the schema of this age, absolutes are over. The idea of claiming an absolute is to say that there is a straitjacket, a moral straitjacket, keeping people from expressing their freedoms, something left over from a bygone era. And in the West particularly, people are seeking greater degrees of autonomy, freedom from any kind of authority. And so the slogan for this kind of belief would ultimately boil down to this, very simply: truth is relative. There are no absolutes. But there are two major flaws which I think become self-evident with this kind of an approach. And the first is very simply posed in the form of a question. What happens when you apply the slogan to the slogan? Now, if someone comes back to me and says all truth is relative, the simple question I would ask in response, well, is that true? Because if you apply their own criteria to the statement that they're making, a claim about the way that the world is, if they say, yes, what I say is true, then they're admitting that they are absolutes. If they're saying, no, what I'm saying is relative, then they're also admitting that ultimately the statement that there is no ultimate truth is itself relative and hence not true. Either way, we're thrown back upon the rocks of there being absolutes. And so it's a rare thing when an entire edifice of philosophy stumbles with just a simple question, but here we have a knockdown argument against it. You see, in both cases, the claim either fails to exclude itself from its own test. And I want you to listen here how Steve Turner, an English journalist and poet, satirically rendered this point in his poem on atheism titled "The Creed." "We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him. Reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust. History will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth, accepting the truth that there are no absolute truths." You see, with one interesting question, you can demonstrate how postmodernity makes the fatal mistake, ultimately, of shooting itself in the brain. For where you have to assert an absolute to deny they exist, I think it's time to rethink your philosophy. But the second fatal flaw with this approach came to me when I was hanging out with my wife in New York City a few years ago, and we climbed the Empire State Building, or to be more exact, we took the elevator to the top of the Empire State Building. I don't have Spider-Man's genes in me. And whilst up there looking out over the vast cityscape, I thought to myself, imagine the foolishness if I turned to my wife and declared to her that I don't believe in gravity. And she would say, "What do you mean, Dan? Of course gravity exists." I said, "Well, maybe that's true for you, but it's not ultimately true for me." And so if I was to mount then, in line with my belief that there is no gravity, the suicide protection bars, and if I was to step over the edge of the Empire State Building, one of two things would happen. Either A, the universe around me would conform to my belief that there is no gravity and I would go flying off like Superman into the distance, or B, my physical body would conform itself to the pavement some hundreds of feet down to the ground. Now, common sense tells us that in our everyday experience, we bump into a reality, a world outside of ourselves that doesn't always go along or isn't controlled by or constructed by the beliefs that we have in our mind. Gravity either does exist or it doesn't. Jesus either was God or he was not. There's no middle ground when it comes to the law of non-contradiction, one of the most fundamental laws of logic upon which all of human reason is based. And so we need to recognize that feelings cannot determine reality. Truth, the picture of the external world out there, is something that's simply beyond opinion. And since every religion or worldview, including atheism, makes claims to describe the world around us, origins, meaning, morality, and destiny, it makes no sense whatsoever then to say that Hinduism is true for the Hindu and Christianity for the Christian and Islam for the Muslim. It just doesn't work. Now, you could say that these people ultimately believe that their religion is true, but sincerity itself is not the criteria for figuring out what is real, what is true about the world around us. And since my friends cannot all be right at the same time, we need to recognize that to hold this position that truth is relative is to commit intellectual suicide and to live out of step with what is real. So what about the second option? Perhaps all religions are just fundamentally the same and only superficially different. I mean, perhaps my three friends are all right in one sense, but they're all just heading in the same direction via different routes. I mean, maybe religions are kind of just the cultural husks or baggage that they've picked up along humanity's true course towards enlightenment. Why is it that all roads can't ultimately lead to God? Now, this is the second path of the religious pluralist in our time. And when Christian theologian and missionary Leslie Newbigin was traveling to India to do missionary work there, he happened across a fascinating little parable that kind of encapsulates this worldview. This is what he said. A bunch of blind men happened across an elephant. One of these blind men felt its tail and said, "God is like a piece of rope." Another one felt its leg and said, No, you're wrong. God is like the trunk of a tree." Yet another one felt God's ear and said, No, God is like a kite. And still another one felt the trunk of the elephant and said, No, God is like a huge snake. You see, in the story, the blind men are all grabbing at a small part of the same bigger whole and get dogmatic about the whole from their experience of the small part. And the implication is obvious, that peripheral dogma has blinded religious people so they cannot see that at the very core, they're actually all grasping at the same thing. There are many ways to God, many paths up the mountain. And what we need to do is just strip back all of the exclusive claims and practices of each particular religion to embody their essence, which is something akin to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, at first glance, this may sound refined, kind of like an evolution of religion for our global village. But if you pay close attention to the elephant in the room, pardon the pun, who is the narrator in the story? How is it that the narrator can see what the blind men cannot? Who is the narrator that knows that they're all grabbing at the same thing rather than at different things or different animals altogether? You see, is the atheist who denied God's existence vehemently going to end up in fellowship with God for all eternity? Does he even want that? Now, will Hitler, who systematically stamped out the Jewish people from his empire, was he on the same path as the Buddhist monk practicing a separation from his desires in the world? And what actually lies at the other end of these paths? What is the final destination? What is meant to be at the top of the mountain? Is it heaven or hell, nirvana, reincarnation, nothingness? And who is the elephant in the story? What kind of God is this describing? Is it a disinterested deity? Is it a personal God or an impersonal force? You see, the belief that all of these are the same is simply absurd. Now, not only does the religious pluralist claim a platform of enlightenment from which it can survey how everyone else is blind, but it forces everyone into a spiritual fog. It doesn't have answers to life's deepest questions. It obscures them. Supposing that education has led to an evolution in divine wisdom, the religious pluralist themselves forces everyone else to readjust their fundamental beliefs to fit into their box, so that neither the Quran, the Bible, nor the Vedas have the monopoly on spiritual truth. But I do, me personally. Without evidence, the religious pluralist claims that a position that is every bit as arrogant and intolerant and exclusive as any other of the other religions that it ultimately denies, forcing everyone else to reinterpret their beliefs just to fit in to its small borders. Try telling a Christian that Jesus isn't the only way, or a Muslim that Muhammad was not the last and greatest prophet, or the Hindus that there is no karmic cycle. Whatever similarity in ethics may emerge from most major world religions, and I actually want to stress, there's far less similarity in terms of morality than you actually think. What we need to recognize is the core beliefs of each religion are inherently, irreconcilably contradictory. It's not the case that religions are fundamentally the same and only superficially different. They're only superficially the same and fundamentally different. Now, take another stanza from Steve Turner's poem on the modern man's creed. He says this: "We believe that all religions are basically the same," at least the one that I read was. "They all believe in love and goodness, and they only differ on small matters like sin, creation, heaven, hell, God, and salvation." Only minor differences. You see, the problem with religion is that you can only know if your path leads to the right destination after you've walked it, after you've passed through the shadow of death. And if I let them speak for themselves, the evidence of my friends' religions suggests that they are actually walking along very different paths. All religions, including the new evolved super religion of the pluralists, ends up being exclusive. Because even when you set out to try and include everyone, you still end up excluding the exclusivists. You see, so why then do we ultimately keep getting thrown back on the rocks of exclusivity? And it's simply this: truth, by definition, is exclusive. Truth, by definition, is exclusive. And so there is a third option open to us: to embrace exclusivity, or to believe that not all ideas are created equal. Now, deep down, I actually want to suggest that I think most people know that this is true, but it's something that in our politically correct culture and the new breed of tolerance, that it's just taboo to be able to ultimately say. All ideas have to be equal. All religions have to be the same. These statements are the new dogmas on the path to political peace. But as we've explored, this simply cannot be true. And when it comes to exploring truth claims, some ideas are better than others in terms of their implications. And what is more, some ideas have more warrant to believe them than others in terms of their truth value. And so it's not arrogant or intolerant to claim exclusive truth. It is just honest. We need to ask ourselves, is exclusivity really such a bad thing? I mean, exclusivity hardly seems to be the enemy of humanity. Consider the realms of relationships. Is it evil or wrong for me to reduce the time that I spend just to a few friendships to be able to build the kind of death that would be life-transforming? Or to commit myself to the love of one woman for one lifetime in the exclusivity of marriage? Is that inherently evil or disruptive for society? I don't think so. Or what about the realm of scientific claims? I mean, these seem to make sense of the natural laws that govern our universe. So is it intolerant or divisive to believe that you have happened by investigation of the evidence upon the best explanation of a particular phenomena? Hardly. Well, in light of these sorts of things, why is it then that we ultimately claim that when it comes to the realms of religion, exclusivity is arrogant or intolerant or evil? It doesn't seem to follow in its very nature. So how then might we sort through the sea of exclusive claims that each particular religion makes? Now, people come to believe, according to philosopher James Sire, come to believe what they do for a whole bunch of reasons. Perhaps my friend was a Hindu because their family and their early shaping community were all Hindus. And so they adopted the beliefs of the people that they grew up with for social reasons, largely so they could fit in and have a starting point to be able to interpret the world. Perhaps my Christian friend became a Christian for psychological reasons. It gave him some sense of personal significance or security or hope that there's some big sky daddy up there looking out over him. Perhaps my Muslim friend made his religious decision because he submitted himself to the religious authority of a sacred book or a sacred person, to the Quran or to the imam at his local mosque. You see, most people believe what they believe for one of these three reasons: social, psychological, or religious. And they usually end up finding a supportive community who believes the same and fosters them in that belief. The problem is these three categories or reasons why people ultimately come to believe are useless in being able to determine what is ultimately true. Because you can find people of any persuasion who have come to believe what they believe for those three reasons. It doesn't give us a window into making the best sense of the world. And so James Sire, this worldview philosopher, suggests that we need a fourth category, what he calls philosophical reasons, a way of being able to test truth claims to see which one seems to make the most sense. And so he gives a series of criteria. He would speak of things like logical consistency. Is there anything within your worldview that inherently contradicts itself? He would speak of things like empirical adequacy. What kind of reasons, evidence, arguments do you have to believe that what you think in here matches the way that the world is out there? What experiments can we perform? What ways can we go and test your claims against the real world? And he would say that there are things like experiential relevance. How can this worldview be believed and lived in such a way that it can lead ultimately to human flourishing? Now, when it comes to Christianity, we believe in an equality of people, but in an elitism of ideas. This is a fundamental difference to the way that our culture seems to work. An equality of people, all made in God's image, equal in value and dignity and worth, but that not all ideas are created equal, and that truth invites questioning, should be ultimately explored. And so the reasons ultimately why, in this case of exclusivity, I end up worshipping Jesus, standing at the foot of the Christian door as opposed to any other, is primarily because in shifting from the exclusive claims to the unique nature of those claims, Jesus stands head and shoulders above the rest in logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. In the way that Jesus would describe the human condition, describing us as made in the image of God, innate value, dignity, and worth, able to do incredibly creative and rational things, able to participate in a community of love and a web of relationships, the desires that drive the human nature. The greatest compliment ever paid to humanity, that we are made in the image of God. But Jesus also diagnoses that we have been damaged by evil, that these desires, the way that we have been wired, has been corrupted from within, so that out of the human heart, our very core of our being, our nature, these desires are disordered and play out in harmful, broken, and devastating ways, so that we've been separated from God and separated from our fellow people and ultimately even separated from who we were meant to be. But Jesus doesn't just diagnose human nature better than any other worldview. He also steps in to offer himself as the cure. And so in the revelation of God in history, Jesus becoming human, putting on flesh, God coming to dwell amongst us, revealing the heart and nature of God, but coming to live the life that reflects God's pursuit and passion for humanity, but then also to die a death in humans' place, to take the penalty for our evil, for our wrongs, for our sin, to stand as a representative, a substitute, that whatever evil we have committed, he paid our penalty and made it possible through him rising from the dead for us to be made right with God. As the great physician, Jesus doesn't just diagnose our condition and leave us there to try and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. God steps in to do what humanity could not, to offer forgiveness and a renewed heart for all that would believe in him. And so experientially, the transformation that comes by encountering this good news of the Christian message has led to the transformation of people throughout history. Consider the quote made by secular historian William H. Lecky in his book, A History of European Morals from Augustus to Charlemagne, where he said that the character of Jesus has not only been the highest pattern of virtue, but the strongest incentive to its practice, and has exerted so deep an influence so that it can be truly said that the simple short record of 3 years of active ministry life has done more to regenerate and soften the hearts of mankind than all of the disquisitions of philosophers and all of the exhortations of moralists. That the life and message of Jesus, out of the mouth of a skeptical historian, has done more to transform humanity over history than every other person put together. Incredible experiential relevance in how it transforms not just the core nature of who you are, but what you live for. But finally, this idea of empirical adequacy. Every other major religion worldview was begun by people whose grave is still full. You can dig them up. You can find bones or DNA remains still within the soil. What message they had was matched only with human ideas, not with supernatural power. And yet for those that would want in our day and age, the skeptics and the new atheists, to dance on the grave of God, the joke is ultimately on them. Because when it comes to Jesus, in the case of his resurrection in history, his grave became empty. And the resurrection of Jesus in history is a case that you can explore. Central miracle, open to investigation and inquiry. This is the rubber stamp of vindication. This is God's divine seal, authenticating all of the claims that Jesus made about himself and all of the things that Jesus did in his death and resurrection. In what way?
Jesus' body can't be found, and everyone, and even as a Christian myself, I've seen that show about the code.
The Da Vinci Code?
That's it, the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
Even the Da Vinci Code, and they lay the claims that Jesus or his mother was buried here, and this was went on there, and everyone's in the search of secret scrolls, and where was Jesus buried, and et cetera, from Christians to non-Christians. It's a catch-22. Yes.
In what way?
You can't find Jesus, where Jesus was resurrected, right? He rose again on the third day. So his body doesn't exist. He's the only God
Sure.
that rose again, and there is no DNA evidence on it. But it's also a catch-22 for people that are fighting against it by saying, oh, well, because his body doesn't exist, how can you prove he ever actually existed?
Well, that's a fascinating claim. I would agree, but it's not because of the absence of evidence that people have come to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but the presence of the fact that there is good evidence to believe a number of things about those events at the time, and that the explanation that God raised Jesus from the dead is the only one that seems to match the facts of what we can be reasonably certain of from history. So the best way of exploring this would probably be what historians would call the minimal facts approach, where there are a series of statements or facts that can be known about the events of that time, both from Christian sources and non-Christian sources combined. Absolutely, which can be known beyond reasonable doubt, so that even in the vast field of biblical and historical scholarship, the majority, meaning 90% plus, skeptical, atheistic, other religions as well as Christians, liberal Christians, would agree that on these facts, but would disagree on the explanation for those facts. And the 5 that seems to be brought across that I think would undermine anything that Dan Brown and his fiction books would send in our way would be essentially this: that they are absolutely certain that Jesus of Nazareth existed and was killed on a Roman cross under Pontius Pilate. They're quite certain about the idea that he experienced an honorable burial in the well-known tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a Jewish Sanhedrin leader. They're even quite certain that that tomb was found empty after the Sabbath by a bunch of Jesus' women followers. That's one of the arguments, but the idea that they believe it's stolen points towards the reality that this tomb, which was well known, did ultimately become empty. And the fact that it was discovered by women followers, as ones whose testimony in the ancient world didn't even count in terms of jurisprudence, is another kind of criterion of embarrassment that says if the Christians were writing their stories, they would rewrite the details to make it more compelling. The fact number 4 is the idea of that Jesus' disciples genuinely believed after his death that they saw him alive. Now, this isn't something that they made up, because there's no explanation as to what would transform them from cowards to martyrs, or what would give them the impulse to reject their Jewish beliefs in favor for an adapted Christian view, especially when for this life on planet Earth they faced immense suffering and being outcast from all of their Jewish origins, as well as if they're wrong about Jesus From their Jewish upbringing, their understanding would have been that we're condemning our eternal soul for blasphemy. Point number 4, that Jesus' disciples genuinely believed, that they encountered the resurrected Jesus. And this wasn't just one or two people. This was groups of people over a period of 40 days in different settings, groups even upwards of 500 people. And in 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul says, many of them are still alive. If you want to talk to the eyewitnesses, you can go and check the evidence yourself. And then point number 5 has to do with the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, the enemy of the early Christian movement, after what he claimed to be a post-resurrection experience or encounter with the risen Jesus. Now, these 5 facts alone are kind of a historical bedrock that nearly everyone agrees in terms of the historical fields, regardless of their religious persuasion or how they explain it. And when you go through the alternative theories about how else can we explain this? Maybe Jesus didn't really die, he just swooned on the cross, or maybe someone stole the body, or they didn't really, the Jewish people did it and the Romans did it, or maybe Jesus' disciples just hallucinated or made it all up for their own ends to be able to create a religious system and try and overthrow the Romans. All of these explanations ultimately fall short when you give a challenge to those interpretations. So I think it's definitely worth exploring the empirical adequacy. But this is the point, that God has left testimony of himself, whether in the heavens, as I'm sure Glenn might talk about a little bit later, and the idea of what we can see in the natural world that points towards a creator, and also in history with the resurrection of Jesus and his revelation through the nation of Israel and then through the church, as well as in the human heart with the desires and the longings that can only be matched and fulfilled by the existence of the God as described in the Bible. And so for these reasons, I think it's why when the search for exclusivity, we should ultimately end up at looking at the one that made the most exclusive claims and realize, though, that those claims were backed up by impressive evidence. And I just want to finish with this, that when it comes, though, to the exclusive nature of Jesus' claims, this needs to be matched by the incredible inclusive invitation of the cross of Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus' death in our place to pay for our evil actually puts everyone on equal ground. There's no spiritual privilege. It doesn't matter whether creed or culture, it doesn't matter your skin color or your gender, your socioeconomic status or your sexual preference, your intellectual capacity or your age. The invitation of the cross of Jesus Christ is that God loves all, that Jesus died to save whosoever shall believe in him. And so, although all religions are exclusive, the uniqueness of Christianity in the midst of that is that the Word of God is not tied to a people or a culture or a subset of humanity. The community of God's people that will inherit the earth, as described in the last pages of the Bible, is more diverse than you can possibly imagine. People of every tribe and tongue and nation. And so the question that we need to continually ask ourselves is, will we be counted amongst them? So I leave that as an investigation for you to explore. It's been great to be with you here today. Yeah.